America's favorite painter had a secret. Behind those happy family scenes, Norman Rockwell was hiding something that could have destroyed his career. In 1964, he painted a scene that made grown men cry and mothers shield their children's eyes. The image showed the ugly truth about America that no one wanted to see. Gallery owners refused to hang it. Newspapers wouldn't print it. But Rockwell painted it anyway, knowing it might end everything he had built. The painting that almost killed his career reveals the real Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell was born on February 3, 1894, in Harlem, New York City, at 789 St. Nicholas Avenue. His parents were Jarvis and Nancy Rockwell. His father worked for a Philadelphia textile company and stayed in that job his whole life. They weren't rich, but they got by. Norman had one older brother named Jarvis, and even though they shared a roof, they were never especially close. His father was Presbyterian and his mother was Episcopalian, which made things a little mixed at home. Long before Norman was born, his family roots went back to England, all the way to 1635, when John Rockwell came to America on a ship called the Hopewell and helped settle Connecticut. Even as a little boy, Norman was different. When he was just 3 years old in 1897, he would sit quietly and listen as his father read Charles Dickens out loud. It wasn't just the stories. It was the way Dickens painted people with words. His father liked to copy drawings from books, and Norman watched him. That's when something inside him woke up. His mother's father had been an artist too, though he never made much money and had to settle for painting landscapes. But the spark had already passed down. Their small home was filled with stories, drawings, and quiet struggles. That's what shaped him. By the time he was 9 years old in 1903, Norman already felt like an outsider. He was skinny, clumsy, and didn't fit in at school. He didn't feel very close to his parents either. Drawing became his escape, something he could control, something that made sense. He spent hours sketching alone, and over time, he began to use humor and exaggerated features to cope with the way people treated him. That same year, his family moved out of the city and into Mamaroneck, a small town in Westchester County. It changed everything. In Mamaroneck, Norman discovered quiet streets, open skies, and new faces. He started falling in love with the idea of small-town life. He became obsessed with the work of Howard Pyle, a famous illustrator of the time. Norman began saving pennies just to buy art supplies. His mother kept a strict religious home, but Norman kept drawing even when money was tight. He watched everything around him, faces, gestures, little moments, and it all ended up in his sketchbook. That mix of city and small-town life stayed with him forever. By 1908, when Norman was 14, he made a huge decision. He left high school and enrolled in the Chase School of Fine and Applied Art in New York. Every day, he took the train back and forth from Mamaroneck. His family didn't have much, but they supported him the best they could. At Chase, he studied life drawing, including classes with live nude models. That was a shock for a boy raised in such a strict home, but he kept going. He was determined. In 1910, he transferred to the National Academy of Design, and soon after, to the Art Students League of New York. There, he learned under teachers like Thomas Fogarty, George Bridgman, and Frank Dumond. Fogarty taught him how to tell stories with pictures. Bridgman taught him how to draw the human body with precision. That's when Norman stopped trying to be a fine artist. He realized his gift was illustration. He wanted to tell stories people could feel. In 1912, at just 18 years old, Norman got his first big job. Fogarty helped him land a commission to illustrate 12 Tell Me Why stories by Carl Claudy. He earned $150 for that job. It wasn't just about the money. That moment changed everything. His work caught the attention of Edward Cave, who was building Boy's Life magazine. Norman walked into the office with hope in his eyes. Cave gave him a chance. He asked him to draw scenes for a camping guide and eventually over 400 illustrations. Norman was still a skinny 140 pounds and 6 feet tall, so thin that during World War I, the Navy would later reject him for being underweight. But in 1912, that didn't matter. His journey had begun. By 1913, just a year later, Norman became the full-time art editor of Boy's Life. He was only 19. That kind of position was unheard of for someone so young. He worked hard, creating hundreds of images that shaped how Americans saw the Boy Scouts. He made their uniforms perfect, their expressions real, their adventures unforgettable. His artwork was so popular that the Boy Scout calendar became the top-selling calendar in the country by 1929. This early success didn't make him arrogant, it made him careful. He knew how quickly things could fall apart. So he worked even harder. In 1914, Norman became close friends with another artist named Clyde Forsyth. They both worked at Boy's Life and rented an old barn that had once belonged to the famous Western artist Frederick Remington. That studio felt like sacred ground. Forsyth pushed Norman to take bigger risks and submit his art to the Saturday Evening Post. They worked side by side, encouraging each other. Norman grew not just in skill, but in confidence. He wasn't just a Boy Scout illustrator anymore. He was becoming something bigger. By 1915, Norman was 20 and convinced his family to move to New Rochelle. It was a smart move. New Rochelle was where the top illustrators lived. Artists like Joseph Leyendecker, one of Norman's biggest inspirations, had studios there. Being in that creative environment pushed Norman even more. He made new friends, met mentors, and stayed close to the publishing world in New York City. It was a risky move financially, but it opened doors he never could have reached otherwise. And then came 1916. Norman was 22. That year, everything changed. He finally submitted work to the Saturday Evening Post. His first cover appeared in May 1916. It was like a thunderclap. Between that first issue and January 1917, he had already painted 6 covers for the Post. People took notice. Even Life magazine ran a full-page ad calling the Post the greatest show window in America. And Norman's work was right in the middle of it. But success came fast and hard. By the time he was 25, Norman was exhausted. He left his job at Boy's Life to focus entirely on the Post. By then, he had already painted 25 covers and dozens of illustrations. It was a whirlwind. Even though everything looked perfect on the outside, inside Norman still battled doubt. Around 1911, he had started feeling deeply insecure about his appearance, his name, even his place in the world. He once said, "All I had was the ability to draw, which, as far as I could see, didn't count for much." But instead of giving up, he poured those feelings into his art. He painted people who felt awkward, nervous, overlooked, and in doing so, he made millions of Americans feel seen. In the summer of 1916, Norman Rockwell married Irene O'Connor, a schoolteacher who was 3 years older than him. He had just published his very first cover for the Saturday Evening Post that same year. They barely knew each other when he proposed at a boarding house in New Rochelle. But right from the start, things felt off. Irene wanted a normal home life. Norman couldn't stop working. He was obsessed with his paintings and often disappeared into his art, ignoring everything else. They never had children. Years later, he quietly admitted something heartbreaking. "After we'd been married a while, I realized she didn't love me." Still, the marriage dragged on for nearly 14 years. By 1929, just after the stock market crash, they agreed to take separate vacations. Irene filed for divorce shortly after, in Reno. Even while his personal life was falling apart, Norman was becoming a national sensation. From 1916 to 1919, he created 25 covers for the Saturday Evening Post, many with World War I themes. One showed a boy questioning if a short man could be a soldier. His work was everywhere. Life magazine even used him in full-page ads to sell subscriptions. But behind all the success, Norman was only 22, and it was already too much for him. He began having anxiety and felt like he couldn't keep up with expectations. His friend Clyde Forsyth noticed that sometimes Norman just vanished for a while, afraid that people would forget about him. By 1920, his artwork was changing. It looked more refined, less cartoonish. He was getting praise from serious artists and had clearly grown under the guidance of his teacher, George Bridgman. But the pressure didn't stop. Norman collapsed under the weight of it all and suffered what was quietly called a nervous breakdown. He had to step away to recover. During this time, he became close friends with the famous illustrator J.C. Leyendecker, someone he looked up to. The breakdown was a turning point. He was still in his mid-20s, already carrying the weight of being the most recognized magazine illustrator in America. As the 1920s moved on, Norman started doing more than just magazine covers. Big brands wanted him for their ads. In 1923, he painted a Jell-O ad that showed a perfect, smiling family in a happy kitchen. That kind of warmth would become his signature style. He worked for other magazines too: Literary Digest, Country Gentleman, Leslie's Weekly, Judge, and Life. These ads paid well and gave him room to experiment. But even then, the pressure never truly went away. In 1929, while staying at Louisville Landing, he and Irene decided to take separate summer trips. Norman went to Europe to visit museums in France, Austria, and Spain. When he got back, Irene told him she had fallen in love with someone else. She wanted a divorce. Even though Norman had a habit of flirting with women himself, the news hit him hard. The divorce was finalized on January 13, 1930. He immediately escaped to Alhambra, California, and stayed with his friend Clyde Forsyth. That's when he painted The Doctor and the Doll. While there, Forsyth introduced him to Mary Barstow, a math teacher and aspiring writer who was 14 years younger. Norman married her just a few months later, on April 17, 1930, in her parents' garden. The couple soon had 3 sons, Jarvis, Thomas, and Peter. But Norman's mental health was slipping again. By 1933, he was hospitalized for what they called nervous exhaustion. Millions of people saw his work every week, but no one knew the pain he was carrying. That same year, he convinced Mary to go with him to Europe, hoping to reignite his passion. They brought their baby Jarvis, who was only 5 months old. In Paris, he studied Rembrandt and other old masters. But instead of feeling inspired, he spiraled into depression. He started calling himself a fraud. He felt like his Saturday Evening Post covers were meaningless compared to the great artists in the museums. His thoughts got so dark that he considered ending his life. That trip left a deep scar. In 1935, a new opportunity came. He was asked to create illustrations for Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. At first, he didn't want to do it, but he accepted. He traveled to Hannibal, Missouri, to study Twain's hometown and took lots of reference photos, which wasn't common among serious painters. The illustrations were published in 1936 and 1940, but looking back, he felt uneasy. Some of the drawings carried subtle racial stereotypes. As the years passed and the civil rights movement gained strength, Norman admitted he regretted how he had portrayed certain characters. By 1938, Norman and Mary bought a 60-acre farmhouse in Arlington, Vermont. They wanted a peaceful life for their family, and at first, it seemed perfect. They went to square dances and town meetings, but behind the smiles, things were falling apart. Mary's drinking had worsened. Norman wrote in his journal about how distant and angry she became when she drank. He couldn't even enjoy the simple things, like swimming in the river on their land. He said the water was too cold, but the truth was that he was anxious all the time. In 1939, Norman started therapy with Erik Erikson, a famous psychoanalyst who had escaped Nazi Germany. Erikson helped him see that many of his happy paintings were actually a way to heal from a lonely childhood. Norman's mother had been cold and distant. He never felt like he belonged anywhere growing up in New York. His paintings of warm, happy families were what he wished he had. The therapy helped him understand that. It gave him strength to keep painting with meaning. In 1942, he came up with an idea for 4 paintings based on President Roosevelt's speech about freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. He pitched them to the Saturday Evening Post, but they weren't excited. They thought the idea might upset readers. But Norman believed in it so much that he paid for the project himself. He used his neighbors in Vermont as models and poured months into the paintings. The following year, in 1943, the 4 Freedoms went on tour across 16 cities and raised $132 million in war bonds, which would be over $2 billion today. Over 1.2 million people saw the paintings. Norman even showed up to sign prints. But not everyone was happy. Some Americans were angry about the freedom of worship painting, which showed people of different races and religions praying together. Rockwell received hate mail accusing him of promoting racial mixing and communist ideas. Some cities in the South refused to display the posters. But the tour was still a massive success. That same year, something awful happened. In late 1943, Norman's entire studio burned down in a fire. He lost hundreds of paintings, props, costumes, and all his personal items, worth about $100,000 back then, over $1.5 million today. Some neighbors said it was an accident from his pipe ashes. Others, including Norman, suspected it might have been arson. He'd had arguments with a neighbor about property lines. No one ever proved anything. What mattered was the loss, his work, his materials, his favorite pipes. Gone in one night, the townspeople brought him new pipes as a sign of love. Also in 1943, he painted Rosie the Riveter for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. Rosie was strong and confident, crushing Hitler's book under her foot. She was based on a 19-year-old telephone operator named Mary Louise Doyle. Norman made Rosie look much bigger than her real-life model, something he later felt guilty about. But while the image became iconic, many male readers were furious. They said it was unnatural and canceled their magazine subscriptions. They didn't want to see women in jobs meant for men. But Norman had already helped shape a new kind of American hero. Behind all this success, his marriage was falling apart. Mary's drinking became worse during the 1940s and 1950s. She had to go for psychiatric care at the Austin Riggs Center. It was a 90-minute drive from their Vermont home. Sometimes she stayed there for months. In 1952, she even received electroshock therapy. Norman felt isolated. He found emotional support in the women he painted, forming close, quiet connections that helped him survive. In 1953, they moved to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, so Mary could be closer to the treatment center. Norman began therapy too, trying to cope with the weight of it all, the fame, the pressure, the sadness at home. In 1946, Norman Rockwell released his autobiography called My Adventures as an Illustrator. He talked about how he often felt insecure and afraid of failing, even though people saw him as a symbol of American happiness. He wrote about his constant stress, the pressure of deadlines, and his perfectionism. But he didn't mention something much darker. Many now believe he used amphetamines to keep up with the intense work pace. He painted happy families, small-town life, and smiling faces while quietly battling anxiety and depression behind the scenes. The book left out that part. It was a safe story, not the full one. Then, in 1951, Rockwell moved his family to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Most people thought it was just for the peaceful setting. But the truth was, his second wife, Mary, was very sick. She struggled with alcoholism and deep depression. She was getting treatment at the Austin Riggs Center, a well-known psychiatric hospital in town. She even had electroshock therapy. Rockwell worked hard to pay for all of it, taking on cereal ads and magazine covers that helped cover her medical bills. While his artwork showed a perfect America, his real home was filled with pain and fear. Stockbridge looked like a dream, but they were there because it was one of the few places with the kind of psychiatric help Mary needed. In 1953, a new kind of trouble came from inside his own family. His son Peter spoke out in public, saying his father had been emotionally distant and obsessed with his work. It became a scandal. But letters later found by Rockwell's grandson told a different story. They showed that Norman had tried to be present. He helped his sons, gave them money for art projects, and even built a mini studio for Jarvis, his oldest. Still, Norman's perfectionism took over sometimes. One magazine cover took him nearly a year to finish, and he had to borrow money from the bank just to stay afloat while he repainted it over and over. He wanted everything to be perfect, but it came at the cost of time with his family. In 1959, Mary suddenly died of a heart attack. Norman was crushed. His sadness poured into his paintings, but the magazines didn't want that. They rejected the darker, more emotional pieces. They wanted joy. His doctor, Eric Erickson, once told him, "You paint your happiness, but you don't live it." That hurt. He kept his grief to himself and pushed it down to keep working, but it wore him out even more. In October 1961, Norman remarried. His third wife, Molly Punderson, was a retired teacher. He was 67 and she was 65. He told people honestly that he married her because she was organized and he needed help. He couldn't handle the business side of his art anymore. After years of struggling with Mary's illness and his own mental health, Molly brought peace and order. The marriage surprised everyone, but it lasted until he died. Maybe it wasn't a love story, but it gave him something stable at a time when he needed it most. Then came 1963. After 47 years, Norman left the Saturday Evening Post. His last cover was of President John F. Kennedy after the assassination. In all, he had painted 321 covers for the magazine. But Norman felt like the world had changed, and he needed to change too. He was tired of only painting happy white families. The magazine wouldn't let him show Black Americans unless they were in the background or doing servant jobs. He once said, "I portrayed the best of all possible worlds. That kind of stuff is dead now." He was 69 and ready to speak the truth. In 1964, he joined Look magazine. They gave him freedom to paint what he truly cared about: civil rights, injustice, real pain. But as soon as he started, the threats came. People wrote hateful letters. Some called him a race traitor. Others said he'd regret it if he kept painting black children or showing racism. Some threats were so serious that his life was in danger, but he didn't stop. Even at age 70, he kept going. That same year, he painted The Problem We All Live With. It showed Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old black girl, walking to school with U.S. Marshals. On the wall behind her were slurs and a splattered tomato. It was shocking. Readers were furious. Thousands canceled their subscriptions. Rockwell used a local girl as the model, but the message was loud and clear. This wasn't the America people wanted to see, but it was the truth. And Rockwell was finally painting what he really felt. All through the 1960s, he tried to make up for the way he had once painted black people in servant roles. He knew he had done wrong. He reached out to civil rights groups, talked to activists, and made sure his new work was respectful and accurate. He didn't want to be seen as a white savior. He wanted to show black people as heroes of their own stories. He listened. He changed. Later in 1964, something terrible happened. 3 young civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were murdered in Mississippi. They were trying to register black voters. The Ku Klux Klan and local police were behind it. Their bodies were found buried in a dam. Rockwell couldn't sleep. He had nightmares. He poured all of it into a painting called Murder in Mississippi. It showed their final moments, lit only by torches, with shadows of the killers surrounding them. He didn't work on anything else for 5 weeks. The painting was raw and painful, but he needed to do it. In 1967, he painted New Kids in the Neighborhood. It showed black and white children meeting for the first time in a newly desegregated neighborhood. It was quiet, not angry, but filled with emotion. He was 73, tired, but still fighting with his paintbrush. In 1978, something strange happened. 7 of Rockwell's paintings were stolen from a gallery in Minnesota. It became the state's biggest art theft ever. One of the stolen pieces was Taking a Break, a 1919 painting. That one was recovered in 2017, 40 years later, inside a New Jersey home. It had been bought decades ago for just a few dollars after someone damaged it during a game of pool, but Rockwell had other secrets. In 2013, a biographer named Deborah Solomon wrote a book claiming he had hidden erotic drawings and possibly had repressed sexual desires, even toward men. She cited diary entries and notes, including one about a young assistant he seemed very fond of. Some experts believed these hints were real. Others, including Rockwell's own granddaughter, said the claims were wrong and unfair. The truth remains unclear, but it added new questions about who he really was behind the public image. On January 10, 1977, President Gerald Ford gave Rockwell the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It was the highest award a civilian could get. But Rockwell didn't go. His son, Jarvis, accepted it for him. He was 83 and very sick by then. In private, he told people he sometimes felt like he had sold out. He made a lot of money, but gave up deeper art to do commercial work. He wondered if he had missed his true calling. He died on November 8, 1978, at age 84. After his death, people found out he had around $50,000 in unpaid therapy bills. That would be about $200,000 today. He had spent a lifetime trying to cope with anxiety, depression, and inner turmoil, even while painting happy scenes for the world. The bills told a story his paintings never did. Then in 2004, something incredible was found behind a fake wall in the home of another illustrator, Donald Trachta. It was Rockwell's original Breaking Home Ties, one of his most famous paintings. The man had made a perfect copy to hide the real one, likely because of a bitter divorce. When the real painting went up for auction in 2006, it sold for $15.4 million. The discovery raised questions. How many more originals were out there, hidden behind walls or stored in secret?